G'day guys, today I'm going to share with you some practical advice on how to absolutely revolutionize the way you approach games of Warhammer 40k and really start putting those wins on the board by an in-depth tactical video talking about the approach that I use and many other top competitive players use when approaching scoring victory points in competitive games of Warhammer 40k. So if you often find yourself in those situations where you're doing a fine job of killing your opponent but you're really struggling to score those primary and secondary victory points, this video is for you. So with that being said, let's get stuck into it.
Exalted.
Unlike some other gaming systems, Warhammer 40k often requires an absolute boatload of dice to play. For example, watch me roll out my attacks with these 20 Khorne Berserkers. Follow the links in the description to get your Exalted dice today. Alrighty guys, so the first point that I want to raise is about focusing on victory points. Now, the game is won or lost based on how many victory points you score. It doesn't actually matter who kills more out of you and your opponent. And this is a trap that I see a lot of people fall into, particularly us bloodthirsty World Eaters players, where we go into the game with this hyper-aggressive attitude and we want to kill things and we want everything to blow up and explosions and blood and skulls and all that good stuff, which is a ton of fun, but it's not super productive if your objective is to win the game. What you need to do is pivot into focusing on scoring those victory points. That's really, really important. And in a singles game of 40k, all you need to do is score one victory point more than your opponent. Another common trap that I see people do is they get past that first point where they go, okay, I'm not going to focus on killing my opponent, I'm going to focus on scoring these victory points. But then what they do is they try to score every victory point. They just go for every secondary, they go for every primary, they try to flood the board, they try really hard to score as many points as they possibly can, and that often results in them overextending and therefore losing the game. So it's worth noting that you only need to beat your opponent by one victory point to secure a tournament win, and that's a really, really important thing to keep in mind. The next is that you want to trade units for victory points, and you want to make sure that those trades are always an effective trade. You can look at your army at the start of the game and you can go, cool, there's 100 victory points available in the game. I want to try to score as many of them as I can. I have this many units, which means each one of those units needs to roughly trade for this many victory points. So hypothetically, let's say you had 10 units in your army and there's 100 points available. You could create a rubric in your mind about trading each one of those units for 10 victory points. And that way, if you successfully pull that off, you're going to get 100. Now, there's a ton of reasons why this doesn't work exactly, but it is a good sort of rubric to keep in mind. So, for example, you might have one unit that sits on your home objective and scores you 5 primary victory points every single turn of the game for the entire game, and that's, a 20-point unit. And then you might have another unit that goes out there and doesn't actually score anything itself, but it cripples your opponent in such a way that allows other units to, and as a result, it can be kind of hard to calculate these things. However, it is something that you want to keep in mind when deciding how you use your units for trades. You don't want to just throw away a unit that goes out and doesn't actually kill the unit that it targets, or it doesn't achieve you any victory points, because that's not an effective use of that unit. You want to make sure that with those trades, you're keeping that in mind of how am I using my pieces to score those victory points, and making sure that you're not overextending, making sure you're not going, cool, there's an objective out here, I'm going to send 5 units out to that one objective and score it. And you've successfully scored it, but it's cost you 5 units to do it because now they're in an exposed position. They might be close enough to your opponent's melee threats or within line of sight of your opponent's shooting threats, and as a result you lose those 5 units. That's a bad trade. So keeping that in mind throughout the game and focusing on making sure that you're making good trades is a really, really key way of viewing victory points. And the last thing that I'll say is just remember, points are the point. That's the whole point of the game, is to try to score those victory points. And if you just keep remembering at the start of each battle round, just remind yourself, points are the point. Points are the point. And if you do that, you'll really start to see that decisions change. Instead of making this decision where, well, how can I position this unit so that I can go out and kill that enemy unit, or how am I going to deal with this threat, or how am I going to prevent him from killing my thing? As soon as you start remembering points of the point, points of the point, points of the point, you'll then go, ah, I see. It actually doesn't matter how he kills that thing. It doesn't really matter what I do in this situation, provided I'm focusing on those victory points. So that's a really, really key element of the game as well. All right, the next point that I want to raise is a really, really critical one, and that is that you should be focusing on your primary first and your secondary second. They're actually very conveniently named types of scores, because during a game of 40k, you can score victory points from multiple different sources. You've got your primary mission, you've got your secondary mission, and then you've also got your battle ready. Now, your primary can score you up to 50 victory points of the available 90. So that's 55% of your total score is going to come from these primary missions. Whereas your secondaries can score you up to 40 of the available 90 points, which is only 45%. So there's an entire 10% worth of points that's different between your primary and your secondary. And then, of course, those remaining 10 points come from your battle ready, and that battle ready is something that you should be expecting to get anyway. Most tournaments don't actually allow you to participate with armies that are not battle ready, so it's kind of a given. So you are playing with that 90 victory points, of which 50 of them come from your primary. So the other thing worth noting with primary is in a lot of missions, now obviously there's a variety of different missions and each one's going to have its own unique approach, but in the majority of them, you can only score primary in 4 turns. You can only score them in battle rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can't score primary in battle round 1. And that means you realistically have those 4 opportunities to score points, and you generally score them in large chunks, right? You'll score 10 points, or you'll score 5 points. You know, it's typically, and then there are some missions where there is exceptions to this, but typically speaking, you're going to be scoring 5 to 10 point chunks. Whereas your secondaries, you can score 1, 2, 3 points from those. So they're more granular, whereas your primary is big chunks. So if you start falling behind in primary, it can become a real disaster for you. Whereas if you fall behind in secondary, sometimes you're only falling behind by a couple of points here and there, which you can pretty easily pivot and focus on later in the game to score. The other thing that's worth noting with the primary and secondary is that typically speaking, primary is about holding objective markers, whereas your secondaries, they can be about killing certain targets or achieving certain actions or holding areas of the board, that sort of stuff. So with that in mind, often when you're holding those primary, that makes it easier for you to score your secondaries. Whereas typically speaking, scoring your secondaries doesn't make it easier to score primary. It's a one-way relationship where if you focus on those primary, you focus on holding those areas of the board, then when it comes into your next turn and you pick up cleanse, it's very easy to do because you're already there, you already control this area of the board. So focusing on your primary is a really key aspect of competitive 40k, and doing so is going to help you score much more points than your opponent because you're going for those big chunks. The quote that I always like to remember here is just to be primed for primary. Make sure that that's the main thing that you're going for, you're focusing on that, and that's how you're going to score your victory points. G'day guys, check out our merchandise at exalted40k.com, including sets of range rulers with 9, 6, 3, 2 and 1 inch faces, as well as 1 inch markings all the way along, making quick and accurate measurements a breeze. Rectangular blessings trackers for convenient record keeping, and chain axe blessing trackers for when merely taking records is not good enough. Dice and dice trays that in tandem ensure your rolls do not betray you like a certain someone on the killing fields of Scalathrax. Objective markers for an exalted gaming experience that are just begging to be drowned in the blood of friend or foe on the battlefield. Show your support for the channel and head over to exalted40k.com to equip yourself as an exalted wargamer today. Alright, so how do we get primed for primary, right? Scoring primary, you want to basically aim for 10 victory points per battle round. Overextending to a 15 early is often quite risky and costs you a lot. Now obviously, each mission's got its different ways of scoring, so I'm not going to go through every single mission and break that down. I'm just going to give you some general overview tips. But most missions, you can score 5 victory points for each objective marker you hold, and then there's variations within that, whether it's do an action to burn one, whether it's creating an objective, whether it's, killing something as well. Like there's lots of different variations on it, but generally speaking, you're going to be scoring between 5 and 15 for your primary. And what you want to try to do is aim for a reliable 10. You don't necessarily want to aim for that big 15. And this is something that I see a lot of people make mistakes with, where in their first turn they go, cool, I need to score primary, so I need to be out on all the objectives. So they send something into the middle, they send something over onto their safe expansion objective, which we'll get into in a moment. They'll send something to take their opponents home. They'll do all this sort of stuff, and they overextend. And then your opponent just seizes that opportunity and picks up all of your pieces, and you lose. So what you're much better off doing is going, cool, I'm going to take my safe expansion objective, I'm going to hold my home, and I'm going to make sure I lock those two down, scoring my 10 victory points. And then your opponent's probably going to do something similar, which is why you get that 10 victory points back and forth. One of the things I like to say is that you should try to hold your home and then pick one midfield objective to be your other, your secondary primary objective, and then just contest the rest. So generally speaking, that second one is what most people call your expansion or your safe objective, and this will be the objective that is closest to your deployment zone and furthest from your opponents. So we're playing on a rectangle board. Often, let's say you're the bottom left corner of a map, you're going to have your home, and then directly above you is going to be an objective that's closer to your deployment zone than it is your opponent's. And generally speaking, that objective is going to have some kind of terrain on it that makes it more defensible. It might be an L-shaped ruin, or even on the GW maps, they have some kind of terrain on there that's going to give you cover, or it's going to give you some obscurity that's going to allow you to hold that objective more safely. So that's typically what people experience as they're safe. It's not always the case, though. Sometimes you might be on a really, really fast army that's more able to take the safe objective off your opponent. Or you might be on a really durable army, and it might be a particular table layout where you're more effective at defending that central objective. It varies heavily. But generally speaking, you want to pick one objective in midfield, claim that one as yours, that you're going to dedicate resources to making sure that you hold that objective, that you have units that jump onto it, and those units are going to still be there next turn, and your opponent is not going to be able to kill you off of it, and they're not going to be able to put sufficient OC on there to contest it. So you want to sandbag one and then protect your home, and now you guarantee that you're locking down those 10 victory points. And if you can do that over 4 turns, you've just scored 40 out of your available 50 victory points, which is a very, very strong position to be in. If you try to extend early, you're often going to find that even you might pull it off. You might pull off that 15 in that first battle round, but then in the next battle round, you only score 5, and you're in a way worse position than if you had have just gone for the 10, 10, 10. So my advice is to always hold your home, hold a midfield, and then just contest the rest. Another thing that's worth noting here is that contesting is just as important as holding, because like we said at the start, you only need to beat your opponent by 1 victory point. So every victory point that you prevent them from scoring is essentially the same as victory points that you've scored yourself. So what I like to do is I like to go, cool, I've got my home objective, I've sandbagged that, I've protected that, and I've put a second objective that I've got a bunch of units on that I'm sandbagging, and then the rest of your army should be going out there and trying to deny your opponent their primary. So if your opponent puts something out into the middle, you either try to kill them off of the objective, or you put sufficient OC on the objective to deny them that objective. And that way you're preventing them from scoring those 5 victory points. And it's worth noting that denying an objective is significantly easier than holding it. A great example could be that, somebody puts a big scary, unit out onto a central objective. Like, let's say hypothetically it's a World Eaters mirror match, just because they're the examples that are going to come to mind. And they've got like a unit of Exalted 8-bound with a Slaughterbound. It's just gone in and killed something off the center, and they're sitting on the objective in the middle. Now, that's a tough, killy unit. It might be hard for you to kill it. However, you might be able to go, okay, cool, there's 3 8-bound worth of OC and then another one for the character. Okay, so I'm just going to put 3 Khorne Berserkers on that objective. I'm going to charge something else, and then I'm going to consolidate 3 Khorne Berserkers onto that objective. That puts 6 OC on there, and now those 8-bound don't score it. And it's that easy. You don't have to engage with them, and you've taken it off them. So it's much easier to deny your opponent an objective than it is to actually hold one yourself, which is why often what you want to do is you want to hold your two primary objectives. Your one in your home and your one that you've allocated or that you've assigned as your main objective, and then you just want to spend the rest of your time denying, because that is a much more effective use of your units than trying to hold the middle, or trying to hold your opponent's safe objective. That's really hard to do. It requires a lot of resources, and you generally have to put yourself in a pretty exposed position to do it. So you're much better off just going, I'm just going to hold my safe, I'm just going to hold my home, and I'm just going to send my spawn out to deny you. You've got a Rhino sitting on that objective over there. Well, my two spawn are going to go out, they're going to charge that Rhino, and your Rhino's 2 OC, I've got 2 OC worth of spawn, and we're evened out. That's a sort of an example of an approach. So make sure that you're talking to your opponent, you're getting what the OC they have on an objective really clear, and then you're looking at the game state and you're deciding, well, what units do I have that I could use to just contest my opponent? I don't necessarily have to fight them for it. I just want to stop them from scoring those points whilst making sure that I score my own. So that's really, really important to note. G'day guys, want to join us and become an Exalted Wargamer? Then check out our Patreon. Show your support for the free YouTube content with a monthly supporter subscription. Think of it like buying me a beer to say thanks, mate. Gain access to the Exalted community, including our Discord server, where we discuss everything from tactics, strategy, list writing advice, to memes, banter, and hobby updates. Join Team Exalted for more direct coaching and advice in preparation for upcoming events, and get tailored advice for key meta environments and matchups, or help working through some of the more challenging and complex aspects of Warhammer 40k. Or become part of the Exalted Inner Circle for access to private one-on-one coaching, including video calls and more, a dedicated coaching service aimed to provide mentorship and drive real improvement. Check out exalted40k.com for more information and become an Exalted Wargamer today. Now when we talk about scoring secondaries, now like I said, secondaries are the second thing you should be focusing on. You should be focusing primarily on primary, and then when it comes to scoring secondaries, what you want to do is you want to deploy your army and move your army with a plan that's based around potential draws. So if you're using the Tabletop Battles app or a similar app, you can generally see what cards are left in the deck. It won't tell you what order they're in, but it'll tell you what cards are available to you. Now, obviously, at the start of the game, they're all available to you, but as the game progresses, you'll start scoring cards or drawing and discarding cards, and you'll end in a situation where you know what cards are left in the deck and you know what's likely to pop up. So checking that and then making sure that you have a plan based on those. So you could go, cool, I haven't scored, established locus yet, so I'm going to make sure that I have a unit positioned in such a way that it can get to the center of the table or my opponent's deployment zone, so that if I draw that card, I can then achieve it. And having a plan for those secondaries is how you go about achieving them. If you don't have a plan and you're just reacting to things, you're going to really struggle to score secondaries. And one of the ways that I recommend people do this is in every command phase, just take a second to plan secondaries. And if you keep that little quote in your mind, take a second to plan your secondaries, you'll find that it's actually quite easy to do. You look at it and you go, cool. And at the start of the game, you go, cool. What if I go first and I score area and I draw area denial? Have I deployed a unit in such a way that it can end within 3 inches of the center of the table? Is that something I have planned? If you haven't planned, you're not going to be able to do it. And then you're going to be like, oh, damn it, I can't score that point. So making sure that you have a unit position to do that. Making sure that you have a unit position so that it can jump out and do cleanse. Now, obviously, in the earlier game, you're going to have more cards, but you also are going to have some cards that will synergize well. So Area Denial and Cleanse is a good example, or Extend Battle Lines is a good example, where you can just jump out and you're extending your battle lines by getting on the center, and you're getting Area Denial by getting on the center. Or you might get Extend Battle Lines and Secure No Man's Land. That's also a nice, really good combo. So keeping those in mind, because if you haven't set somebody up to go to the center, now you're not able to score either of those cards, and you're going to be kicking yourself. So having a plan, and then every single command phase, when you draw your cards, you want to look at what's left in the deck. You want to look at it and plan, because then as you're planning your movement, which is the very next phase that you go into, you will already be thinking, it might be turn 3, I still haven't drawn behind enemy lines. So whilst I'm moving things around, I want to make sure that I'm moving something so that next turn, if I do draw behind enemy lines, I have something positioned to score it. Whereas if you don't take a second to plan your secondaries, you're going to really struggle to score these victory points. Now, the other thing that's worth noting on secondaries is, like we said, contesting is the same as scoring. Well, denying is the same as achieving. If you deny your opponent's secondaries, that can go a long way towards scoring them yourself. So this is another one of those reasons why you don't necessarily want to run out and control all the objectives early. Because if your opponent gets storm hostile objective, they can just go, oh cool, well, you put 2 spawn on the center objective, I can go and take that from you pretty easily, and now I get my storm hostile. And if they get overwhelming force, they can kill you off of it easily. Exposing a Rhino, while your opponent still has Bring It Down available, can be quite a big problem. So making sure that you're playing around the secondaries by not only planning for what you can score and what you're trying to do, but also planning around what your opponent has the capacity to do. And if you're recording the scores in the app, you can also see what's left in your opponent's deck. I did a detailed video on this a few weeks ago, so you can check that out. But basically, that video was around that secondary component specifically. But basically looking at the app to figure out what cards are left, and then making sure that you're not presenting anything that's going to make it very easy for your opponent to score their secondaries, is a great way of shifting that paradigm. Because generally speaking, what's going to happen is your secondaries are going to be your tiebreaker. Because they are scored in smaller increments, it's very rare that secondaries are what's going to win you the game. It's not very common where you're behind on primary, but you win because you scored more secondaries than your opponent. Typically speaking, whoever wins the primary is going to win the game, and the time that secondaries matter is when you tie your opponent on primary. Sometimes if you're only behind by 5 primary, but you did really, really well on secondaries, that can edge out a win, but typically speaking, they're a tiebreaker. And as a result, you don't want to give your opponent an excess of them, and you don't want to over-prioritize scoring them yourself. You want to make sure that you're focusing on making sure that you get that primary throughout the course of the game. So there might be some situations where you could score a secondary, but you choose not to because you're saving those units to secure primary or contest primary. So a good example could be, you've got your Exalted 8-bound, they've rapid ingressed last turn, they've gone out, they've charged something, killed it, consolidated behind a wall, and then you tick over to your opponent's turn, and you draw Bring It Down, right? Now, they've got a Land Raider or a Land Fortress for Votan or a big Tyranid monster or something, and you're like, cool, this Exalted 8-bound unit, it could go out and kill that thing and score me my Bring It Down. However, if I do that, my opponent is then in their turn going to kill my Exalted 8-bound, and now I no longer have that unit. And as a result, I can no longer use that unit to control, contest, or score my primary. So I'm going out, I'm scoring the Bring It Down, I'm killing something, I'm getting 4 victory points for that. That's great. But now my opponent is going to score their primary every turn for the rest of the game because I no longer have that missile that can go in and kill my opponent off. So instead of going and killing that Land Raider or whatever, you might actually be better off moving over into a different area, killing an infantry unit that's holding an objective, because now you've denied your opponent that 5 victory points, and you might have put your 8-bound in a position where they don't just immediately die in response, which means next turn you can use them to do more stuff. So making sure that your secondaries are secondary. Your primary is what you need to be focusing on, and focusing on that by making sure that you retain your units and you only ever aim to control your home objective, the one that's in your deployment zone, and typically speaking, the objective that's closest to your deployment zone, furthest from your opponents, because that's generally the easiest one to hold. If you just go, I'm just going to hold those every turn, I'm going to take my secondaries secondary, I am going to plan for them, but I'm not always going to execute them. That's the best way to view your secondary objectives. G'day guys, let's take a second to thank today's sponsor Adept Roll, a bloody ripper app that calculates expected outcomes across a variety of in-game scenarios with precision. With Adept Roll, you can input or import unit profiles to calculate probabilities of outcomes and apply modifiers both offensively and defensively within seconds, allowing you to make wiser and more informed decisions when writing lists and when making in-game decisions. Adept Roll is free to use, or grab the paid version, which is an inexpensive and packed full of fair dinkum features that will help you play like an exalted wargamer today. Thanks again to Adept Roll for sponsoring the video, and now let's get back to the show. So a bit of a recap. Basically, remember that points are the point. That's the whole point of the game, is to score your victory points. You know, winning the game is a ton of fun, and I think most people will find that it's more rewarding to win the game than it is to just go around killing things. You know, if you want to go around killing things, that's awesome, and it's a ton of fun, but there's something deeply rewarding about that strategic element and being able to win the game. And as a World Eater player, we can have both, because often we're able to do both simultaneously, so that's great. But remember, at the end of the day, points are the point. The next one is to be primed for primary. Just remind yourself, every single battle round, primary is the objective. It is our primary objective. You know, there's a reason that it's named that. It's not a coincidence, and you should be focusing on it mainly. You know, don't sacrifice units to go score secondaries that you would later need in order to score your primary. Don't overextend trying to score all of your primary now and sacrifice your capacity to score primary in the later game. Make sure that you're focusing on your primary as your primary. The next is hold 2, contest the rest. Contest the rest is an easy quote to remember, and it'll help you sort of make sure that you aren't overextending. Make sure that you are just protecting those two. Now, it's worth noting on this one that in order to contest the rest to be valuable, you actually have to hold the 2. If you don't hold your home, or if you don't hold your expansion, you can be in a really tricky spot where now all of a sudden you need to, you know, take riskier plays with secondaries, or you need to take riskier plays for primary if your opponent's able to successfully deny you your expansion objective. So making sure that you sandbag that is really, really effective. My favorite way as a World Eaters player to do this is to put Khan, 10 Berserkers in a Rhino, and in the first turn I advance that out and I try to get it behind a wall on that objective. Because it's only 2 OC, but because of the World Eaters' reactive disembark, if your opponent tries to come near that objective to contest you, you can reactively disembark and just dump a whole bunch of Berserkers on there, which are 2 OC each. So you can basically use a single Rhino to be Schrodinger's Rhino, and we talked about this in my Rhino Masterclass. You can basically put that Rhino on that objective, and it's very low OC until it's not. But the Berserkers are still inside that Rhino until they're not. And that's a really effective way for World Eaters to basically secure that objective. It's very hard for your opponent to dislodge you. They're probably not going to be able to shoot the Rhino, and even if they did, they shoot the Rhino, the Berserkers disembark onto it, so they need to have multiple layers worth of damage dealing to take you off that objective. It's very hard to do. If they send something out that's going to try to charge you, you can just reactively disembark, and now they have to fight Berserkers. That's a problem. You know, there's lots of stuff you can do there. So that's one thing, and then I use Jackals to hold my home. And then typically what I'll do is in turns 2 and 3, those Jackals that were holding my home will move towards that safe objective, and at that point, turn 3 or 4, that's when Khan and the Berserkers will disembark and go to engage with my opponent to deny them their primary. And that way you've sort of moved, you know, around the board that way. So that's one of the things that you want to do, but you need to make sure that you are securing that secondary objective. The next is take a second to plan your secondaries. That's really, really important, is that every time you're drawing those cards, once you've drawn the 2 cards, just have a look at what cards are left available to you. And then start planning them. Start thinking, okay, how am I going to score these? And that way, if your opponent's score has a really good turn of scoring, you can go, okay, now I'm a little bit behind. I need to focus on my secondaries, and I need to actually go out and score them. And if your opponent has a really bad turn of secondaries, you know that you can reactively sort of play with the levers of power there, and you can, you know, shift your focus on secondaries as the game progresses. But keeping that primary focus on your primary objectives will allow you to do that. If you find yourself in a position where your opponent has denied your safe objective and you only scored 5 primary, now you can be in a position where you actually have to score those secondaries. And that is a disaster, because as soon as you're in a position where you have to score secondaries, that puts your opponent in a position where they get massive value out of denying your secondaries. So that's really important to make sure that you're planning your secondaries so that you have the capacity to do that and be flexible, but also making sure that you never sacrifice your primary in order to do so. And then the last thing is to be careful with your trades. Just don't overextend. As a World Eaters player, when we are killing things, we're doing it in combat. often in order to prevent and deny our opponent objectives, we have to do it by putting our units out in the open. So we are hyper vulnerable to overextending trades. We can't just move our, Riptide out and shoot them off an objective and be like, haha, you're not scoring that objective anymore, and my Riptide's all the way over here and it's safe. We, in order to kill them off an objective, we have to send our unit to the objective, which has a lot of advantages because it allows us to get on the objective ourselves, as opposed to being out in the, in the backfield somewhere. But it does expose our units to enemy damage. So you want to make sure that you're not overextending and sending things out. One of the rules that I like to think is when I'm trying to move a unit out onto an objective, I ask myself, if I move it here, can my opponent kill it next turn? Right? And if they can, I just don't move it there. Because moving it there means your opponent comes out, they kill it anyway, you still don't score that primary, and your opponent gets to take a unit. Now, there are some obvious examples where this might not necessarily be the way you approach it. For example, you might have a CP to sticky the objective on death, or you might be using that unit to bait your opponent into a position where they don't want to be. They might have to send something of theirs out to kill you that you can then trade back and forth on. So there are exceptions to that rule. But as a general rule of thumb, if you don't think that you can hold an objective, don't try. Because trying to hold something that you can't hold is the definition of waste. Putting units out there in order to hold an objective that your opponent can quite easily kill you off of is a very ineffective use of your units. You want to use your units to deny them whilst holding yours. So picking 2 objectives, sandbagging the piss out of them with a ton of models, holding them, and daring your opponent to try. Your opponent's not going to. They're going to hold their 2, and then they're going to throw something out into the middle, generally speaking, and then you're going to go, cool, what's the one thing they threw out into the middle? I'm going to counter that. So now neither of us hold the middle all game. That's just getting traded back and forth. We both hold our 10, I hold my 2 objectives, you hold your 2, and then the secondaries become the tiebreaker. And that's why it's really important to, take a second to plan your secondaries, because if it comes down to that tiebreaker, you need to make sure that you win by that 1 point. And sometimes that's all it takes, is that one turn when you had planned for your secondaries and they hadn't planned for theirs. And because you were focusing on primary and so were they, you tied on primary, but you were planning for your secondaries, they weren't, and as a result, you score the win. So they're my tips that I've gathered from my years of working with competitive 40k players, and these are really, really effective. Now, it's worth noting 40k is one of the most complex games imaginable in terms of the amount of different scenarios, the amount of different armies that exist, different combinations of units, and then you layer on top of that different game states, different dice rolls, different sequences, whether you're going first or second, different card draws. There's so many factors, so you do need to get, nothing can basically replace reps. Get a bunch of reps in with these things in mind, and you'll find that some of these will resonate more with you than others, and that's totally fine. But these are really good points for somebody who's getting those games in. These are good things to remind yourself when starting out with competitive 40k, and when looking to improve with competitive 40k. If you keep these points in your mind, you'll do so much better than if you're just running around trying to kill things. If you're looking at your opponent's units and thinking which ones are scary, which ones can kill me, and how do I kill them to prevent them from killing me, and you view the battle like that, you'll lose the war. And the war is all about winning points. So I hope you guys found that helpful. If you did, like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit. And also, make sure you check out exalted40k.com, where you can pick up a ton of apparel, merchandise. I've got dice on there now. We've got shirts on there now. We've really expanded our range, and everything that's purchased through there, I get a small cut from that I can then use to improve the quality of this content. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure to check out Exalted 40k. Check out our community over there as well. We've got a Ripper Discord community where we do one-on-one coaching, where I can help you with the specifics of these sorts of things. We also write lists together. We have a joke together. There's a memes channel in there, which is a ton of fun. We share hobby updates and all that good stuff in there as well. So, as always, thanks for tuning in, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.